Pues muy buenos días, tengan todas y todos ustedes. En nombre del Instituto Mexicano de Tecnología del Agua, integrante del sector ambiental, encabezado por la Secretaría de Medio Ambiente y Recursos Naturales de México, les damos la más cordial bienvenida a este primer foro virtual de Agua y Minería en México, desafíos para una gestión integrada de agua y territorio. Saludamos a todas y a todos los que nos acompañan desde esta plataforma, así como a quienes nos siguen a través de Facebook Live del Instituto Mexicano de Tecnología del Agua y de la Cátedra UNESCO IMTA, El agua en la sociedad del conocimiento. Este espacio de conocimiento en línea es posible gracias pues, a las importantes personalidades y expertos que tenemos reunidos esta mañana, que compartirán su experiencia y sus perspectivas con todos nosotros y, por supuesto, gracias a cada una y a cada uno de ustedes por formar parte de esta comunidad de conocimiento. Este foro está siendo grabado para posteriormente tenerlo disponible en Canal IMTA de YouTube y en nuestras redes sociales con todo gusto para todas y todos ustedes. Como habrán notado, sus micrófonos están silenciados y así permanecerán a lo largo de toda la jornada para tener una mejor experiencia todos juntos de este foro. Y la interacción, que es un aspecto fundamental para este espacio de conocimiento y para este diálogo de intercambio, será a través de la ventana del chat de esta plataforma, y en Facebook Live es el espacio de comentarios por escrito. Los invitamos a plantear sus preguntas y sus comentarios en cualquier momento de las exposiciones, señalando, les agradeceríamos mucho, señalando a quién dirigen su pregunta o su comentario, o si es una pregunta o un comentario abierto, pues también indicarlo de esta manera. Rápidamente les comento que a lo largo de esta interesante jornada tendremos 2 conferencias magistrales y 4 mesas de análisis, una en torno al medio ambiente, el agua y la minería, otra analizando el marco legal y administrativo de esta relación. También tendremos una mesa específica contemplando los aspectos de contaminación del agua por las actividades mineras y la minería, derechos humanos y agua. Sin más preámbulo y para iniciar con este foro, tenemos el honor de contar con la presencia de la Secretaria de Medio Ambiente y Recursos Naturales, María Luisa Albores González, a quien saludo con muchísimo gusto. Secretaria, le escuchamos con muchísima atención en su mensaje de apertura de este foro. Muy, muy buenos días, secretaria.
Hola, buen día. Agradezco al doctor Adrián Pedroso por la invitación y la verdad es que me siento afortunada en darles algunas palabras y algunos comentarios en este primer foro virtual de agua y minería en México. Considero que es muy importante el hacer un buen análisis de lo que ha pasado con el sector minero en nuestro país. Recordar que hay muchas concesiones en este país, en pueblos y en lugares donde el agua, y el agua lo recuerdo, es el líquido vital. Sin el agua no podemos vivir y entonces tendríamos que pensar que siempre el agua debe estar disponible para las poblaciones. Yo quisiera platicarles y comentarles que 20 años viví en la Sierra Nororiental de Puebla y en 2014 se dio una concesión a una empresa minera donde estaban trabajando 7,527 hectáreas en 3 municipios de la sierra y justo en el municipio de Cuetzalan del Progreso, el espacio que se llevaba esta minera era la parte más alta. Estoy hablando de los cerros más grandes de los que querían hacer uso estas mineras. El problema es que si se empezaba a hacer uso, y estoy hablando de minería a cielo abierto o a tajo abierto para extracción de minerales, todo el agua de todas las comunidades abajo y llegando hacia el estado de Veracruz se iba a contaminar. Entonces, se pudo hacer un amparo legal y parar a esa minera. Quisiera comentarles y contarles esto porque siempre tenemos que colocar en el centro a la vida y por eso es muy, muy, muy importante que haya foros abiertos donde se planee y se plantee y se pueda tener la escucha de todas y de todos. También sé que va a participar el sector minero, pero recordar que en el centro, y eso lo hacemos desde la Secretaría del Medio Ambiente, tenemos que pensar en el ser humano y en las personas. Tenemos que planear y pensar qué actividades sí pueden realizarse. La actividad minera, en el caso de la minería a cielo abierto, a tajo abierto, afortunadamente ya fue prohibida para nuevas concesiones por parte de nuestro presidente. Y yo lo aplaudo como un gran logro, porque también nos tocó vivir cuando estuvimos trabajando con comunidades náhuatl y totonacús, el cómo se pueden querer hacer actividades, pero si no se consulta a la población, a la gente que está en los lugares y que va a ser afectada, no puede entrar un proyecto de esta índole. Pues yo agradezco al doctor Pedroso que haga estos foros abiertos a ustedes, a la gente del IMTA, del Instituto Mexicano de Tecnologías del Agua, que participen las voces que deben de participar. Creo que también va a participar el sector minero y que estamos para eso, estamos como dependencia a la escucha, pero recordar que somos la dependencia del sector ambiental, hablo de la Secretaría del Medio Ambiente, y a quienes nos debemos justo es a las personas, al pueblo de México. Pues les agradezco mucho que inicie ese gran diálogo. Seguramente después me van a compartir toda esta riqueza que salió en este foro y agradezco en verdad en poderles dar un saludo. Les damos este saludo desde Campeche. Hoy vamos a visitar un área natural protegida muy bonita. Estamos acá con los compañeros de CONAM y pues desearles un foro exitoso y adelante. Muchísimas gracias por darnos la palabra.
Al contrario, muchísimas gracias, secretaria, por darse el espacio de compartir este inicio del foro y por supuesto que estaremos todos muy conectados y compartiendo los resultados de lo que aquí se comparta y seguiremos conversando. Se está abriendo un espacio de conversación en otro de los temas fundamentales para el medio ambiente en nuestro país. Muchísimas gracias, secretaria de Medio Ambiente y Recursos Naturales, María Luisa Albores González. Mil gracias, le invitamos.
Gracias.
Las actividades. Muchísimas gracias. Y para continuar y para iniciar con la parte técnica de este foro, yo tengo el gusto de presentar a ustedes al maestro Jorge Velázquez Suárez. Él es subcoordinador de Tecnología Apropiada en el Instituto Mexicano de Tecnología del Agua, quien hará la presentación de la conferencia magistral de apertura de este foro sobre agua y minería. Yo saludo con muchísimo gusto a Jorge Velázquez Suárez. Él nos dará algunas indicaciones y nos hará favor de presentar a nuestra conferencista magistral, a Nadja Kunz. Jorge, ¿cómo estás? Muy buenos días. Te saludo con mucho gusto.
Hola Marco, muchísimas gracias. Gracias por pasarme la palabra y de nuevo también gracias a la secretaria María Luisa Albores por su mensaje. Como bien lo indicas, vamos a pasar a la parte pues, un poco más técnica, ¿no? A la de las charlas. La primera charla que vamos a tener el día de hoy es de la conferencista invitada Nadja Kunz. Esta primera charla va a ser en inglés, pero antes de cambiar al idioma inglés quisiera hacer rápidamente presentarles a nuestra ponente. Ella es profesora adjunta y catedrática de investigación de Canadá en gestión y administración de agua de minas de la Universidad de Columbia Británica. Antes de unirse a la Universidad de Columbia Británica, pasó 2 años como becaria postdoctoral en el Instituto de Investigación Acuática de Iwan en Suiza y fue consultada como especialista de agua para la Corporación Financiera Internacional. Nadja tiene un doctorado del Instituto de Minerales Sostenibles y una licenciatura en Ingeniería Química y Gestión Empresarial, todos de la Universidad de Queensland en Australia. El objetivo general del programa de investigación de Nadja en la UBC es revolucionar el uso y la gestión de agua en las minas para reducir los riesgos y maximizar las oportunidades desde la perspectiva desde las diversas partes interesadas, incluidas las empresas, los inversores, el gobierno y las comunidades. Les recuerdo a todos nuestros participantes, tanto de Zoom como de Facebook Live, que pueden hacer preguntas en cualquier momento de la charla de Nadja. Lo pueden poner en Zoom mediante la aplicación del chat y en Facebook Live en la sección de comentarios. Si quieren hacer algunas preguntas y no se animan mucho en escribirlas en inglés, no se preocupen, ustedes la pueden escribir en español y se le va a traducir también a la ponente. ¿No? En este momento voy a hacer igual la misma presentación, voy a cambiar a inglés también para darle el espacio a Nadja. Welcome everybody, my name is Jorge and I will be your presenter to the first season. I'm honored to introduce our keynote speaker, Nadja Kunz. She's an assistant professor and Canada Research Chair in Mine Water Management and Stewardship at the University of British Columbia, jointly appointed across the School of Public Policy and Global Affairs and the Norman B. Kevill Institute of Mining Engineering. Prior to joining UBC, Nadja spent 2 years as a postdoctoral fellow at the EWAC Aquatic Research Institute in Switzerland and consulted as a water specialist for the International Finance Corporation. Nadja has a PhD from the Sustainable Minerals Institute and bachelor's degrees in chemical engineering and business management, all from the University of Queensland, Australia. The overarching goal of Nadja's research program at UBC is to revolutionize the use and management of water in mines to reduce risk and maximize opportunities from the perspective of all diverse stakeholders, including business, investors, government, and communities. Her talk is titled Water Stewardship in Mining Regions. Nadja, please, thank you very much for being with us in this first Mining and Water webinar, and please go ahead, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and buenos dias. I'm very, very sorry that I don't speak very much Spanish, so I will be presenting in English today. It's really a great opportunity to be able to share some of my work with you, and I very much look forward to the discussion. Today I am joining you from Vancouver, and I'm located on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam people here in Vancouver. My presentation today is focused on water stewardship, and I'm going to walk you through kind of broadly where the mining sector has been transitioning in its approach to water management over recent years, but also to highlight some of the remaining challenges that exist for really improving the relationship between mining and water. So I wish you a very good conference, and I hope to be able to participate as well in some of the sessions today. So I'm going to begin with a slide to emphasize why why water is so important from the perspective of mining companies. And in Vancouver, in Canada here, we have a conference. We had a conference several years ago where one of the companies had been doing some calculations to look at how much water they were moving around their mines compared with how much ore they were processing through their mineral processing facilities. And as you can see from the numbers on the left of the screen, in some cases, the amount of water that sites were moving in order to process ore and minerals was, orders of magnitude greater. So they were moving around 15 times the volume of water compared to the amount of ore. And so, for this reason, when it comes to water issues, mining companies are not only in the business of mining, but also in the business of water. And it was really interesting to hear these phrases being said from very senior levels of a company, Goldcorp, during their presentation. But in some parts of the world, water-related infrastructure can also be very significant investments for the mining sector. And so the investment community also, increasingly sees water as an important issue. And some calculations have been done to look at, how much infrastructure costs for water compared with other capital expenditure. And in some cases that can be around 10% of the cost of new projects. So water is very expensive for access as well in some parts of the world. And so why does mining need water? And this may be something that many of you know, but just in case, I think it's important to explain some of the reasons that water is such an important input for mining operations. So for the majority of mineral separation technologies, a lot of them rely on water as the mechanism, as the medium through which separation takes place. So if we think of processes like flotation, where we're mixing ore materials with water and grinding the materials very fine and separating the valuable material from the waste product through flotation chemistry, water is essential for that process to take place. And therefore, water is a really necessary input for the way that we process ores within mines at the moment. Water is also important in a lot of dry environments for dust suppression and equipment washing as well. So in Australia, this is a particular challenge with lots of mines being in very arid environments, and water is needed to avoid too much dust being generated from facilities because otherwise it could have impacts on local communities and also on the health of workers. Water also allows us to transport ore and product, somewhat more easily. So it's also, we transport things within slurry form as well on sites. And in some mines, water may also be treated for potable uses of employees. So these are just some of the reasons why mining needs to have water as a requirement for processing to take place. But it's also no surprise to us that water is also a resource that the mining sector can have very significant impacts on. And so, there are many different ways that the process of mining can interact with water systems, whether that be surface water or groundwater systems. And also seawater, because increasingly seawater is in some parts of the world, like Chile, also becoming a resource for the mining sector to access water. So just to talk through some examples, and I'm sorry that I don't have any Mexican examples here, but to just explain some of the different challenges that can exist in relation to mining's interactions with water. The top left-hand picture there is actually a very large piece of mining equipment called a dragline in the Bowen Basin region of Queensland. And several years ago, there was a major flooding event in the Bowen Basin. And at that time, a lot of the mines, the coal mines, became completely underwater because of that flood. And that flooding event and those impacts actually resulted in a number of months of lost production for the companies. But they also raised a lot of concerns from local communities and also from governments around what the impact of that saline water would be on local ecosystems. So those floods were very costly for the companies, but also raised a lot of attention on the regulatory side. And in some parts of the world where water is scarce, there can also be lots of competition between mining and other users of water. So whether that be making sure that there's enough water for environmental needs, and also in areas where there's significant agriculture and mining, this can also result in conflict around how to allocate water for different uses. Water quality and health is also a significant issue, whether that be from the impacts of water discharge on water systems that people rely on, or also through legacy issues such as acid rock drainage or other water quality problems. So after the mines close, if these water issues are not well managed, it can have very long-lasting consequences for the environment and for communities. And of course, the significant infrastructure failure from the tailings dam in Brazil, the very tragic failure. I mean, we've seen a number of very tragic failure events from tailings in recent times, and these events are caused by many variables, but water and excess water in dams can sometimes be one trigger that can lead to failure of infrastructure such as tailings. So for these reasons, there are many interactions between mining and water that really need to be managed and thought through. And I just wanted to also present some slides here, and I apologize, these figures are very detailed, but just to emphasize the main trends that are shown on this slide. This is some research from some Australian researchers, but they have done similar studies in other parts of the world and found similar trends. And I just wanted to explain that, when we think about the kinds of water issues that are faced on mining, there are a lot of variables that are resulting in these issues becoming more complex and ever more important. So across the world, in many places, average ore grades are declining. And as you can see on the left-hand side of the screen, this shows that for a number of commodities, since the last 100 years, there's been an average decline in the quality of the ore. So in order to generate the same amount of product, that means we have to dig more rock out of the ground in order to process the valuable mineral that we want. And in addition to that, as the middle picture is illustrating that statistically in general, as ore grades get lower, the amount of water that is used to process the product tends to go up. So this chart is for gold. You can see that as ore grade gets lower, the water consumption goes up, and this is a similar trend with energy. And on the right-hand side, we also can see that because of the growth in or the decrease in ore grades, we're also going to be generating more waste rock as well as generating larger tailings dams. So we have, because we're producing more waste for each ton of product we're producing, tailings dams are set to get larger. So, this is this is assuming that there won't be any changes in technology. They're the kinds of trends that we may expect to see in future. So this is why technological improvements around the way that mining uses water and the way that we manage waste on sites is so important, and a really key issue that needs increased research attention. And I know that for the conference today, one of the key topics is around the growing nature of conflict around mining projects, and also the kinds of connections that has with water issues. And this slide is from some research done by the International Council on Mining and Metals. And the figure on the left is showing from two different sources that they looked at the growing incidence of mining community conflicts over a 10-year period. And you can see that there are more reported incidents of conflict in the research that they had done. And also when you drill down to understand what the underlying causes of conflict are, very often environmental issues, and that includes water issues, but especially water issues are very often an issue that is of concern to local community members. And so we can certainly talk through a number of places where conflicts around water have been very significant for kind of the development of the mining sector, and also have had a lot of valid concerns from communities. But it's not only the community, not only from the community side where there's more attention to water, but also, from the point of view of investors. And this is something which is not directly water related, but as I said, tailings and water do have a very close connection. And so these slides are emphasizing some of the calls that have come from the investment community following the Brumadillo tailings disaster. So a number of very large institutional investors and managers of different funds, really put pressure on the mining sector to be more transparent around where its tailings facilities were located and what the potential risks were around those facilities. And so I think more and more the role of investors as a force for trying to put additional pressure on companies to improve water and tailings management practices is going to become ever more important also. And it's certainly something that companies are increasingly aware of in terms of their transparency around water reporting and also around tailings reporting. And so I'm just going to talk a little bit about how I've personally observed the industry strategy evolving, and then I'm going to talk about what I think is still needed for the industry to improve its approach on water management. So when I first started working in this sphere, when I started my career, I would say that the approach that most mining companies took to water management was largely a very technically focused discipline. And so if you look at those activities on the left, these are activities that are described in a lot of literature. If you look back 10 to 20 years ago around what good water management was defined as, these are the kinds of things that, that was perceived as being the types of activities that were important for mines in managing water. And a lot of these things are around making sure there's enough water for operations, avoiding discharge volumes that could exceed local regulations, maintaining acceptable water quality and reusing water. All of these things remain very important for the mining sector. But largely they're what I would refer to as an internally oriented strategy from a company perspective. And what we're seeing more and more as a result of these pressures from the community side and investors, and also from regulatory pressures, is this trend towards the term water stewardship. And those activities on the right there are things that are taken from the International Council of Mining and Metals and what they define as water stewardship. And you can notice two key things that I want to emphasize about this new approach to water stewardship, which is different from the approach of the past. So one of them is that, as you can see, some of the last point there on the right around effective management of water within the operational boundary, this is really emphasizing that a good water management strategy is a building block for being a good water steward. So there's recognition that companies still need to have good water management in place, but the things in the blue are really very new and different challenges for mining companies to implement. So these activities are very different from in terms of the skills that are needed to implement water stewardship. So they're very focused on external engagement around transparency and accountability, engaging effectively and proactively with stakeholders beyond the fence, and adopting catchment-based approaches to decision-making. And for some of you who may also be familiar with government initiatives like integrated water management, there are also some parallels with this catchment-based thinking when it comes to stewardship. So how can companies adopt this water stewardship strategy in collaboration with government, but also being distinct from government, are some very significant remaining research challenges and important practical issues that need to be thought about. So just to kind of say one thing that I think is missing when I've looked at how companies are adopting different water-related water risk management strategies, is that when you look at the definitions of how companies define what a water risk is, it still is a relatively narrow definition. It's very focused on issues such as scarcity, stress, flooding, and what I'm arguing for in a lot of my work is that this definition of water risk needs to be much broader. And so I've recently just had a paper accepted into the Journal of Water Security where I emphasize that when we think about water-related risks, there's a real need to distinguish between the kinds of business risks that companies can face, so the ways that water can disrupt operations from flooding, the way that water quality can impact the production process. Those are what I would refer to as business risks. And these are very distinct from the risks on the right-hand side that local communities and the environment face. And so there's a need for equal attention to both of these sides from company side. And when there's not adequate attention to issues that are outbound, the kinds of risks that are faced on society and the environment, this can ultimately cause conflicts and flow back on companies. And this kind of framework is actually one that I developed drawing upon some research from Diana Kemp at the University of Queensland, where she'd argued that the term social risk had been conflated within the mining sector. And I'm arguing here that I think our definition of water risk is too narrow, and that it also needs more definition in terms of how we're defining what a water risk is for the mining sector, and recognizing that risks arise very differently for different kinds of stakeholders. So within my research program at the University of British Columbia, my work is really focused on these two dimensions of risk and also thinking about risks from other dimensions as well. But on the one hand, I'm very interested in continuing to do research on mine water management and understanding the risks that water can pose to mining projects and to business, but also to understand the outbound risks that water can pose within communities and on the natural environment. And so, you know, having these two pieces together is really important for overall being able to understand these dynamics between the inbound risks and the outbound risks. So within my research team, we do research in many different countries, and I'm very privileged to work with students from many parts of the world, including a number of students from Latin America. And the work that we're doing is one of the reasons that I find it so exciting to work across different regions on water issues. And one of the things I tell my students when I'm teaching is that it doesn't matter where in the world you go, there's always going to be a water problem. So if I think about Australia, you know, an arid environment where water scarcity is a challenge, making sure that the risks around scarcity are managed well. That's a very, very different environment to a lot of Canadian mines, where they're much more challenged with issues relating to too much water and water quantity risks. And the other challenge, which is becoming increasingly important in the Canadian context, is that of the impacts of climate change on water. So in Canada, areas in the north are set to get warmer, and the impacts on permafrost, on frozen ground, can have significant consequences around the stability of infrastructure, and could potentially lead to more risks in future with changes in permafrost. So some of those issues really do differ in different parts of the world, and I think for me it's what makes working in this field so exciting. So I'm going to just finish my presentation today by going through some of the findings from some of our research and emphasizing why I think this broadened view of water risk is difficult for the mining sector, but also how I think the mechanisms that are important to improve this approach. So when I did my PhD research, I was studying a particular mining site and looking at how individuals within the company talk to one another about different kinds of issues. So when I began my work, I said I did a survey with different individuals at this site. So each dot in that diagram represents one person in the company, and the lines show who they talk to about information relevant to their work. And what you can see from this diagram is that the mining team and the processing team, which are the two largest technical departments on the site, you know, they're connected, but they don't talk to each other very much. But what was really interesting was that when I asked them about who they talk to on water issues, these communication barriers became even more significant. And so there was actually a complete lack of frequent communication between the mining and processing teams about water. And you can also see that the number of dots on the right is smaller than the number of dots on the left, which means that people are not talking as often about water issues when compared with other kinds of priorities that they have on the site. And so this is very important from the point of view of water, because water systems and water management on mines requires a systems approach. It requires connections across the site, because the kinds of decisions that are made within the mining department have implications for the processing teams. And so communication across these groups and across these disciplinary silos is very important. What I also found was that the health, safety and the environment team was very important for brokering communications between these groups. And so water was largely seen as an environmental issue on the site, and they were the ones that were seen as being responsible for water. But I would argue that it's also important to have an integrated view of water where there's some shared responsibility around water issues around the site level. And so there's some of the challenges that exist internally within companies But when my team has also done some work recently looking at some of the challenges that companies have to engage externally with stakeholders as well, in particular with local community members when they're developing engineering designs. We did a survey with 88 respondents we had from Australia and Canada. So we were looking at members of the Australian Institute of Mining and also the Canadian Institute of Mining. And we asked the respondents how likely it would be for them to ask community members for feedback during their mine design decisions. So this is during the very early stages of mine design. How likely were they to ask communities for input? And what we found was that although a lot of respondents recognized that stakeholder engagement was important, there weren't as many doing that as what we had hoped. So it wasn't as likely that that people would be asking local community members for input. And so I think this is so important from the engineering point of view to educate engineers about the importance of community engagement early. And our work more broadly, we've been actually doing an ongoing project in Mongolia with an exploration company called Erdene, which is trying to engage very early with communities on its mine design decisions. There are not as many examples of companies that really engage well at an early stage, and sometimes there can be reluctance to do so. So it's been, there are many reasons for that, but I think it's something that does need to change, because as a project moves from exploration to operations, and as it quickly moves through feasibility, those decisions that are made early are more difficult to change as a project moves forward. So early engagement on these issues is very critical. And so in relation to these kinds of coordination challenges, they can take several forms. We need to have better engagement. You know, company boundaries don't always align well with where water catchments are. So this can result in challenges around how to manage water at a watershed level. We also have coordination challenges with respect to how local companies communicate with external stakeholders, and that relationship can sometimes be complex. There needs to be integration across different kinds of actors at a watershed scale. And also what's referred to here as vertical interplay, where there needs to be coordination from the site level to the corporate level, and also up to some of the international associations which are promoting good practices within the industry. And these kinds of definitions of fit, horizontal and vertical interplay are drawn from some research by Holyman and Dobromsky, who actually did work looking at some of the challenges of institutionalizing integrated water resources management as a concept in Mongolia. And I have argued that when it comes to companies and mining, they also have a very similar kinds of coordination challenges that they face. Another challenge that we've noticed in our work, and this is from one of my students who recently finished her master's research, is that when it comes to valuing water, the valuation of water is very difficult. How do we measure the cultural importance of water to local communities? And when asking, so my student did interviews across 10 different mining companies, and she spoke in total to 20 people. She spoke to people from the project professional team, which is PP in this slide, and the sustainability professionals, or SP. And what she found in her work was that overwhelmingly, there's challenges with engineers when it comes to dealing with issues that they can't quantify well. And this is often an issue with water. We can easily measure how much it costs to purchase water, but how do we measure what the value of water is? And how do we quantify what the long-term impact is on local ecosystems from poor water management practices? And unfortunately, what she found was that if engineers can't quantify these things, or economists have trouble quantifying these things, unfortunately, they can be forgotten about. And so when we're able to quantify things, they're easy to integrate into our decision-making. But when they're hard to measure, we don't have the right tools, we don't have the right mindset or skill set to think about these things well. And so another, and I just have 2 more slides here about what these challenges are. So I also feel that when we're looking at improvements in water technologies and what kind of water investments should be made to improve water management practices, there's a real need for understanding how those decisions around water will impact other kinds of issues on the site. And so just to talk through some brief examples of things that I think require some more attention. So often when we implement technologies to reduce water use or to save water, this can also come at an energy cost. So if we think about implementing technologies to reduce the amount of water in our waste streams, very often that's energy intensive. And so there needs to be a decision around how important is water when compared with energy, and how do we make decisions about what is the best choice when we're considering multiple objectives at the same time. And likewise with things around social trade-offs, there are a number of examples of what that can entail. But when we think about moving towards drier waste facilities, which has a lot of benefits and is really important from the perspective of reducing risks around failures, for example, what will be the impacts of that for dust creation, and what could be those issues that also need to be managed. So I think that when we're considering decisions around water technologies and water investments, we should never do it with a narrow lens. It's really important to look at these questions from a broad perspective and to recognize that water is so connected into many other elements within a mine site. And so my team is starting to think about how do we put these things together. So we know that there's communication challenges within sites. We know that there's also challenges of engaging externally. And yet we need to integrate different perspectives and different points of view when we're making choices around water planning. And so one of my students, Alice, will be drawing upon multi-criteria decision analysis as an approach. This has been used very well in the context of urban water planning and other areas of water, but it hasn't been as well applied in the mining sector yet. So we're planning to adopt this approach as a way of understanding what is actually the best choice around water technologies when we consider different objectives all at the same time. And so that's the direction that our work will be moving in future. So in summary, the mining sector poses a number of different water-related risks, and these risks arise in different ways depending on whose perspective one takes. So from a company side, there are risks. From a community side, there are risks. And likewise, investors, governments, and First Nations right holders have very different concerns around water and mining issues. So the point is, we should never assume that water risks are the same for everyone, because these perspectives may be very different. And although the mining sector's approach to water has shifted from one of water management to water stewardship, I still think that there's a need for a broader approach to understanding what we mean by water risk, and that companies need to make sure that they're paying attention to those outbound risks around water issues, and that they're doing this across the entire mine life as well through meaningful engagement with local communities. And finally, mitigating these risks does require a systems approach that considers impacts in different ways, from different spatial scales, from different temporal scales, and also from different points of view. So thank you very much for your attention today, and I'm very happy to answer any questions that you may have, and you're always very welcome as well to connect with me by email, on Twitter, or via LinkedIn. So thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Nadia, for your presentation and to share with us a little bit of your amazing work. We have some questions and also some comments. We're gonna, save all the comments and questions, and if we don't have the time to read it to you, we're gonna send it to you so you can read them in your home. So we're gonna start with one first question that it says, the awakening of social and environmental awareness puts mining activity at risk, or does it force it to carry out its activity with best practices and respecting more the regulations?
That's a really great question. And I like that question because it also points to the fact that these questions around the risks are not only a negative thing, but they're also very much a positive. There's a positive side to these issues as well. And I think that if from a company perspective, I do think more and more we'll see the ability to be a good performer socially and environmentally will increasingly be a source of competitive advantage for companies as well. And even there's a consulting firm, Ernst & Young, that do a survey every year with senior executives from mining companies. And one of the things they found for the last 2 years running, when they've asked companies, what is the main risk, the main business risk that you face, social license to operate has been the #1 issue that companies have identified compared with all other issues. So I think that more and more being a good and responsible user of water will be a really positive thing from a company side if they're doing it well, but also for local communities. Obviously, this will hopefully lead to more responsible mining, and something that I think is obviously a key and important issue that needs to change.
Thank you, Nadia. We're gonna go for our next question of Maria Antonieta. Are specific mining standards for water quality and sediments in place? What about analytical methods and detection limits? And what about contaminant detection in aquatic organisms?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, at an international level, I know that there are a number of standards. Like there's been a new standard called IRMA, which has come out recently around different best practices. And there certainly are a number of international standards to try and identify what good practices are. But I think also with a lot of these, from a regulatory side, a lot of those standards for what is acceptable from a water quality point of view also need to be defined locally with the local context in mind as well. So I think that's where, from a regulatory side, where strong regulation and also strong enforcement of those standards is very, very important. And I do think one of the positive things about where technologies are going as well is that the cost of monitoring, because of our improvements in data analytics and data science, is improving. It's actually easier for us to monitor things at lower cost than what it was in the past. So I think they're positive improvements from the point of view of being able to enforce some of those standards. Yeah, I hope that answers the question.
Thank you, Nadia. Now that you're talking about the local communities and the local legislation, I want you to read another question that links with that. That says, in water stewardship, how can we include the incorporation of communities living and sharing the same land and water where mines are? This is especially important with the most vulnerable communities like indigenous people live.
Yeah, I mean, I think that this is probably what is, on the one hand, there's recognition that companies need to go outside the fence, but my observations from talking with different companies is that they don't always have the right skills to know how to do that in a meaningful way. So I do think that one of the things that needs to happen is much more integration between social responsibility teams in companies and the technical specialists that may understand water issues very well. But I think there's also a very important role from a government side and also from the point of view of NGOs and other actors that can be more neutral in those interactions between companies and communities to also facilitate and build trust, because often these conflicts, trust is really the key kind of secret ingredient for making good collaboration work. So if there's no trust, then it doesn't matter the technical issues, how well those technical issues are being managed. That ability to communicate and understand the community's needs and to engage vulnerable communities who may have different requirements when it comes to engagement. I think that this really does require a different skill set for companies that is very different from what they needed to do in the past.
Thank you, Nadia. You say something really interesting about collaboration, work, and trust. Well, to have this, to have both, I think that we need also like open access to the information about, you know, water quality and contamination and discharge. And this comment open up to our next question, that it says, what is your experience with participatory water monitoring programs where the communities and mining companies work together?
Yeah, actually some years ago, I worked on a paper with some colleagues at UBC where we were actually mapping out community participatory water monitoring programs. Actually in Latin America, we were looking at what those programs entail and how they function and what the gaps were. And I guess I would say two things about what we observed. One is that there certainly was lots of evidence of participatory water monitoring programs existing, and that they were being seen as really important for as one mechanism that can help to improve this collaboration. I think that there's a huge value in the educational side for communities to be able to see water data and to be able to understand and learn sometimes technically around these issues. But one of the gaps that we observed, and I think that it's a really interesting question to reflect on, is around who is leading the programs and who controls the data. So is it led by are these programs led by the company? Are they led by the community? And who ultimately is defining what objectives are important? And I guess our observation was that there's lots of participatory monitoring schemes that are led from a company side, but also that there were some really interesting examples of community-led and community, initiated programs as well. And I think it would be very interesting to understand better what kind of program actually leads to better outcomes in terms of, you know, addressing those concerns communities have. So I think the structure of what makes a good participatory water monitoring program still needs more research, is what I would say. But I think that they're excellent kinds of initiatives that are a very practical way for companies and for communities to work together more effectively and to understand one another's point of view.
Thank you very much, Nadia, for your answers. I think we that's it of the questions.
Sure.
There's more comments and questions around, but we ran out of time. But thank you very much for sharing with us your experience, your work, and your answers of these questions. And thank you for being with us in this first webinar of water and mining.
Thank you very much. Muchas gracias. And